Welcome back. And of course, thanks for staying with us here on Morning Live. So, very important discussion that we're about to get into now. About 65% of South Africans feel that elections are the best way to choose their leaders, while 3 in 10 people say that other methods for choosing the country's leaders should be adopted. Now, this is according to a survey that was conducted by Afrobarometer South Africa. It also found that most South Africans value elections, but majorities do not believe that elections actually work well in order to ensure that voters' views are reflected in Parliament and to enable voters to remove leaders from office. Now, as the Bill of Rights in South Africa's constitution grants all citizens aged 18 and older the right to vote, the question is, how much will not voting in the next election threaten South Africa's democracy and take away people's voices? So to discuss this, we are joined virtually by Mbali Ntuli, who's the CEO and founder of Groundwork Collective, and Professor Bheki Mngomezulu, who's the director for the Center for the Advancement of Non-racialism and Democracy. Professor Mbali, thanks to both of you for joining us this morning. Now, let me just start with you, Mbali, with regard to Afrobarometer, the team that went around South Africa, led, of course, by the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. They interviewed nationally a sample of 1,582 adult South Africans between November and December 2022. Would you say this is, a number that represents the majority of South Africans' views? Is that a valid sample, so to speak? And is this something that we should pay attention to, Mbali?
Thank you so much for having me. Yes, I think that for the survey and the way that it was conducted as widely as possible. Obviously, that there are links to show how the methodology was used, which was across the length and breadth of South Africa, all different types of communities, rural, urban, and a large sampling in terms of the age group of people. So I think it is fairly representative of the average South African. Obviously, it's a snapshot in time at that particular time of what was happening, and there'll be surveys that will be conducted throughout. And it's not necessarily considered a poll, it's a survey on the feelings of how people are feeling. So I do think that it is representative of what most South Africans are going through. And I think you'll see from some of the results, they're unsurprising to us, both anecdotally and because of the way that they've applied their data. So I think that certainly the methodology that they used is one that we can take seriously. And I think some of the findings from it are increasingly troubling and are things that we are finding. I mean, we've also done our own surveys and our own focus groups and research as the Groundwork Collective, and the results that we have really do mirror what has come out of the Afrobarometer survey.
And I would echo that, just speaking to people anecdotally, it also does seem to bear out these same sentiments. Professor, the issue here for me is that we almost approach this discussion around electoral reform in some instances as a taboo, as if we're not meant to talk about changing a system that is, for all intents and purposes, given the Constitutional Court judgment that we've seen, perhaps broken.
No, thank you very much, SK, for having us here. First of all, let me just reiterate the point that was made by Mbali, that when it comes to deciding between a population and a sample, it's not the size that matters, but it's the composition of the sample. As Mbali was saying, if the sample is representative of the population, then of course the results are said to be valid. That is how we approach it in research, because you can't interview everyone, but you have to make sure that each and every group is represented. As for your main question, yeah, indeed, we normally don't talk about elections until it's about election time, which is exactly the cue we are getting from politicians. They will forget about you for 4 years, and towards the end of the 5th year, they will remember, by the way, we have the electorate. These are the people who voted us into office, and we have not been able to deliver services. Let's go back and see if they still remember us. And that is the time when we'll see some of them pretending to be sleeping in shacks just because they have cameras. After that, they go back to their mansions. So that is the reality we are faced with. We don't normally talk about elections for 3-4 years, and then on the eve of an election, only then do we talk about that, which is a concern because we should be talking about this constantly, given the fact that under normal circumstances, we expect that politicians should be our servants. We as the electorate, we are giving them a mandate to go and govern on our behalf. Unfortunately, in some instances, once they're in government, they pretend as though they deserve those positions, they fought for those positions, and therefore they are law unto themselves, which shouldn't be the case. They should be representing our interests because we are the ones who put them there. We should be talking about that constantly.
We should, but as you point out, Professor, we don't. Mbali, for example, a simple thing like recalling an elected representative who perhaps is not performing, you take that particular scenario at local government level, it shouldn't be that difficult. Why haven't we addressed this in almost, 30 years of democracy now?
So this is where the role of civic education also needs to come in. And I agree wholeheartedly with Professor. We can't have these discussions every 5 years. In between elections is when democracy happens. So right now, I think we're all guilty of the fact that we don't have a way that we constantly are able to tap into the democratic process. We don't go to our council meetings. We don't demand constituency report backs. We don't question why our ward councillor doesn't answer to us or why the political party doesn't force him to. And there's a Structures Act, there's a Municipal Act, there's a speaker. There's many ways in which we can actually recall somebody who's doing that. But we haven't, as South Africans, gotten into the habit and the culture of holding our elected officials accountable in between elections. We've given away that right by thinking that we vote every few years and that that's going to miraculously create political parties to have some kind of ability to be scared of us, and that's not going to happen. And this is why you see what comes out in this Afrobarometer survey of people saying that democracy is not working. They're saying that they want other ways to elect leaders. Almost a growing majority of that survey says that they would forego elections in order to be able to have anyone who could just provide housing and security and jobs. And that is incredibly worrying, because what that says is that we could be sitting with a growing majority of people that think that the efficacy of elections is not real and therefore are willing to give their votes to anyone who will do that and effectively become some kind of autocratic state. And that's because we haven't done the job of civic education and teaching people how to be able to voice their concerns and how to get accountability in between elections. And if we don't do that quickly as South Africans, what we're going to find is that the findings of the survey are very quickly going to become the reality that we live in. And I think that the call to say that they don't want to support elections, particularly 2/3 of young people have said that they are going to refuse to take part in next year's elections, is something that we need to get concerned about, because that means we're going to have a growing cohort of young people that just don't ever get into the habits of voting.
And Mbali, such important points there. And Prof, to segue from Mbali's assertion there, that Afrobarometer survey also showed that South Africans support elections, but their doubt is about the efficacy of those elections, and they express little trust in the Electoral Commission as well. Now, how worrying is this, given what Mbali has also stated as someone who's doing work on the ground about young people who seem totally disillusioned with the system?
SK, let's start with this thing of voter apathy, whereby people decide not to vote. That one is very dangerous. And in fact, I was glad when the people who were presenting these results from Afrobarometer also hinted on that point. If you don't vote, technically you have voted. The only difference is that you voted for someone you don't like. Because if you don't vote, the other people are going to vote, and the person who will emerge in that election is going to represent your interests without you having a voice in that. So voter apathy is indeed a problem. But unfortunately, we are contributing to this, all of us, because when we have meetings where these nominations take place, for example, the youth will say, we are not represented as the youth. And then the question is, did you attend the meetings where the nominations took place? If the answer is in the affirmative, well and good. But then if the answer is in the negative, it means already we have contributed to the problem. If you were part of the meeting and you didn't suggest the name of a capable young leader, and then instead you voted for the elderly person, you cannot then come back and say there is no generational mix and therefore it means that the youth are being sidelined. What role did you play? So we are all to blame for that. Then on the issue of the IEC, I have a serious concern, SK, on this one. And in fact, I've raised this issue and I've written some opinion pieces on it, saying that if you slash the budget of the IEC, don't expect the IEC to perform miracles. Because for them to be able to execute their constitutional mandate, they do need money. Now, if as government, you slash the budget of the IEC, what do you expect the IEC to do? Because they can only do their job if they have the financial resources for them to be able to do that. In between elections, the IEC should be assisting communities in terms of educating them. What is a ward councillor? What is an executive mayor? What's the difference between an executive mayor and a mayor? That kind of education cannot be done solely by the IEC, especially under the current financial constraints. So we do have a serious problem. All of us have to own up and say we have a role to play in the current state of affairs, because if we don't change, then the status quo will remain, and then voter apathy will become a problem, and then our democracy will fade away, and then we'll come back and complain and say, how did we lose this? And it will be too late for us to regroup.
I totally agree with you in terms of all of us having a role to play here, Prof. But Mbali, again, as someone who's at the coalface, if we talk about young people, the youth, whether it's voter apathy, whether it's disgruntlement, whether it's disillusionment, I just want to, at this point, place myself, or try to place myself in the position of the youth in South Africa today, with the astronomically high unemployment rate in the country to begin with, struggling for access to all sorts of resources. It isn't too difficult, without rattling off every single issue that we could, to understand why young people are not really fully participating. But I also, look at this in terms of the work that you do in terms of civic education. Is there enough of that? Because I don't think there is, to actually make young people aware of how they can play a role, where they can play a role, and how they actually can become active participants in the electoral system. What's your view, Mbali?
There definitely isn't enough of it. Obviously, my organization has a huge focus on civic education. We've already gone out now in this June month. We are registering young people, but we also are having a dedicated civic education curriculum that's given to them through animation, WhatsApp videos, making the information bite-sized and accessible to them so that it's not hitting them over the head with like a lot of pieces of writing. And you can already see that people have never heard this information before, to the point that Professor was making. You can't expect someone to go out and vote for a ward councillor if they don't know what a ward councillor is or what they're supposed to do. So if we haven't done that work before, it's no wonder people are feeling disgruntled and discontented and politics away, and particularly young people who have been promised the world if they would just be able to study, stay in school, that there would be able to be opportunities, and that just isn't happening in South Africa. And so there's a visceral anger that we are finding on the ground when we register people, from young people who are angry that they don't have jobs, they don't have opportunities, and that they're willing to do anything if somebody could just tell them where to find this information or where to go. And so we're trying to plug into that niche, we're trying to play that role. But as Professor says, it's a huge role. And the IEC has been underfunded for several years from being able to do that. And so I think even us as citizens need to put some real pressure on giving the IEC not just voter education funding and running elections, but in between elections being able to do the education work, and also to support civil society that does this work, because again, without those change makers that we see on the ground who are literally holding our democracy in their hands, we are in huge trouble. And if we have so many young people, the majority of whom make the population, 13 million of them who are eligible to vote, who are deciding not to, we have a serious problem, because our voters' roll is also emigrating and it's dying. And all that's going to happen is political parties are going to be able to always take out their little people and continue to be able to act with impunity, while the rest of us wonder what it is that's going wrong. You also don't get new entrants into the political market if you don't have people who can vote for them. So with the best intentions, any new political parties, anyone with a great idea, is not going to go anywhere, because there's nobody left in the voters' roll to vote for them, because the political parties have cut it up for themselves. And so what also happens is that we then lament, oh, we have so many political parties, but they don't do well. But that's because no political party can start, run an issue campaign, and also register people all in one election. And I would know because I've been in that particular role for a long time. So we have a lot of work to do in South Africa, particularly around civic education.
Professor, we've got 2 minutes, but, there are so many issues that we could still touch on. But I want to get to the point of how do we then change things. Mbali's doing her bit with her organization, with the civic education, which is absolutely key. And, from our perspective as the media, as a public broadcaster, I think more needs to be done in that instance as well. So we all need to look at ourselves and look at where we can do better in this particular effort. But how do we go about actually changing the system? Because for the most part, it seems as though we shy away from that discussion. If things are not working, they need to be changed. So how do citizens come forward and, agitate for the changes that they want to see?
That's a very important one, SK. First of all, the issue of civic education is a big concern. And SK, I can share with you a piece that I wrote where I was lamenting that the dissipation of civic organizations in South Africa was a disaster. And then I'm glad that the likes of Mbali are then trying to restart that, because if you don't have civic education, then it means people are not informed and they will take decisions being ill-informed and they will only regret later. And then secondly, I don't think that political parties are doing a great job. Each and every political party is supposed to have political education for its members so that by the time they vote, they know what they're getting themselves into. Otherwise, they are going to vote wrongly and then they'll keep complaining without solving the problem. And then lastly, I think all institutions, including our churches, by the way, we should all get involved in educating our community so that when they vote, they know what they're doing, not to stay away from voting just because we are disgruntled and then complain all the time, or vote for the wrong person and then complain afterwards. So all of us have a role to play. And then lastly, we need to have a relook at our electoral act if indeed it is taking us to where we want to go. If it's not working, let's revise it. Then look at the Constitution. If there are certain sections that are not helping us, let's have a relook at that. As for the general public, of course, it will always be a problem because government will only listen to you when you go to the streets, unfortunately.
And that is where we have to leave it for this morning. But I'm hopeful that we will have many more such conversations. Mbali Ntuli, CEO and founder of Groundwork Collective, and Professor Bheki Mngomezulu, director of the Center for the Advancement of Non-racialism and Democracy, talking to us about Afrobarometer survey that looked at South African sentiments on voting in next year's elections and the caliber of the country's leadership as well. Let us know your thoughts at Morning Live SABC.